Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of The National Interest, and my guest today is Shelby Magid, the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasian Center. And Shelby is one of my favorite people in Washington. She is an expert on Ukraine and Russia. And today we're going to kick it off by discussing Moldova, which just had an election which resulted in a pro-Western orientation and ended up foiling the designs of Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. Shelby, tell us, what's your take on the election? Why do you think it turned out well despite the Kremlin's disinformation efforts?
Well, Jacob, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for saying I'm one of your favorites. The feeling is mutual. And I'm really excited to be here and talk about this because we don't often get to discuss good news. And the results of Moldova's elections are quite good and even better than most expected. So you mentioned that Putin was foiled. And I would actually say his efforts have been foiled twice in a row in Moldova. They had major consequential elections last year for the presidential elections with an EU referendum, major Russian interference then. Russia poured in lots of money, lots of hybrid operations, and they lost. And then again in the parliamentary elections, this time, major money behind it, vote buying, illicit finance, hybrid warfare, bomb threats, you name it, they tried it. And the pro European party won with a clear majority. And so I think that there's a couple of reasons this happened. One, because a lot was learned during the presidential elections last year. Two, the Moldovan people genuinely want better economics, more democracy, and an EU path. And the governing party and a lot of NGOs, European states, and others did a lot of work in a creative way, dynamic way, getting the message out saying, if you want a better path, it's not with Russia. It's with the EU. It's with working on our country. It's reforming. And also pointing out all of these Russian tactics, saying they're trying to buy your vote. They don't care about you and your future. Putin's just trying to have Moldova under their boot, under, the same threat that Ukraine has. And the Moldovan people rejected that, especially with help from the diaspora. But it was a great success for the elections.
One thing that's interesting about the Moldovan politics is that you actually have a female leader, Maya Sandu, which is, not always common in Eastern or Central Europe. And I wonder if you could tell us something about Maya Sandu, who was born in 1972 and is the sixth president of Moldova since 2020.
Sure. So I will give a shout out to the region and say that we have seen some female leaders, and they often don't get credit for having this. So we've seen a female president in Georgia. We've had women in Ukraine as prime minister. But Maya Sandu really, I mean, she stands out right now in how successful she's been, not just as a president, but as controlling a ruling party and winning very tough elections and getting EU support behind her. She is a reformer, and I would say she's a great communicator. So she's really communicated about what's at stake for Moldova and what her government is working on. Is her government perfect? Absolutely not. They have more work to do. But I think that she comes across as very serious and genuine. And that is seen in Moldova, but also abroad. And that gets her more allies and advocates. She's also been very clear in her messaging about the threat of Russia and the importance of supporting Ukraine, which is, of course, Moldova's neighbor. And that fear is real in Moldova for people that they don't want to be under attack like Ukraine. But she points out we have to stand strong with Ukraine. And of course, they have great relations with Romania, their neighbor. So I think she's this operator, this communicator, this builder, and she's really done a fantastic job with it. And she's hugely consequential for Moldova's history.
One thing that occurs to me is that Vladimir Putin does not really cotton to the idea. He seems to be particularly contemptuous of female leaders. And I wonder if that's another reason why he's invested so much effort against Moldova. but that's just speculation on my part. I wanted to ask you about Maya Sandu's tweet a few days ago. She tweeted, "My thoughts are with the people of Georgia who stand for freedom
Mhm.
and their European future. Democracy cannot be silenced. Moldova is by your side." Now, it's very interesting. You really are having these events happen contemporaneously, that Moldova is pushing for a pro Western path. And there are events in Georgia right now with the protests that are also trying to rescue the nation's future, are they not?
Yeah, first I just wanna point out the Putin, you know, he has many flaws. I'd add toxic masculinity to that, and I would say that Lukashenko is the same, and so Lukashenko underestimated Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in the elections in 2020 and still underestimates her, and I think that these guys don't like anyone Democratic, but if it's a woman, oof, that's probably even worse. Um, as for Georgia, it was a great tweet by Sandu, a great sentiment, and I think there's a lot of connection and meaning there. If you look at the rallies and the protests and the people showing up in the pictures in Moldova and Georgia, the masses on the streets, you see a lot of young people and you see a lot of EU flags. You also see some US flags, some Ukraine flags. You don't see the Russian flags and the actual democratic rallies. And so both countries have masses of people that want an EU path. Both have, been in the process of trying to get this EU candidacy, work on reforms. And Georgia is almost a nightmare situation for Moldova of where they could go, a nightmare situation for Ukraine. There's, of course, a lot of differences, full scale war in Ukraine, but Georgia and Moldova both have a frozen conflict of sorts. They have, the Kremlin looking at them, wanting to have them in their sphere of influence, undermining them in many ways. And the people in Georgia have been pushing back, protesting for what is it, over 300 days now? And
Yes.
so, unfortunately, the government situation is very different in Georgia and Moldova, in that Georgia has this I don't even know exactly what to call them because they're not just Russian stooges because they're for the people of Georgia, but they're Russian oriented, looking towards China. They're certainly not democratic. And Moldova just escaped that. They voted against that. And there's hope when you see in Moldova that that could be a future for Georgia eventually.
Well, Georgia has gone backwards, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it did look very promising for a
Yeah.
time, but now you have this guy, Bidzina Ivanishvili, uh, who has launched kind of that it's been on a pro-Russian course, the country. And there was a story the other day how they had kidnapped one of his former advisors I think, in Dubai. I mean, Georgia does seem to be headed in the reverse direction, and I guess it's partly because Putin had obviously invaded. That was the first country that he
Mhm.
invaded. Well, after Chechnya, after the Second Chechen War, but Georgia has kind of been the canary in the coal mine, right? As far as Putin's aspirations to resurrect the old Russian Empire.
Absolutely. Putin wants this Russian empire. We see that. And he doesn't respect the independence of other countries. And I think these countries are also a playground in a way, a testing ground. And we've seen that in Moldova, testing a lot of these hybrid tactics. In Georgia, we saw that test with the, 2008 invasion and then continuing these tactics. You mentioned the oligarch in Georgia, Bidzina Ivanishvili, and there's speculation on whether he's just a Russian stooge or if he's Georgian that has the influence from Russia. There's another guy like him in Moldova, Elon Shore, but Elon Shore had to flee, and he's now, I believe, in Russia, and he funds a lot of these interference operations in Moldova. And so Moldova has been able to avoid that state capture through the oligarch. And unfortunately, Georgia, I would say, does have it. And it unfortunately keeps getting worse with them changing laws to make him, they've changed laws on the offshore banking. They've changed laws on the NGO status, and it does seem to get worse. But the people have not gotten numb to it. They're protesting. They go out. You can look on social media, and Georgians are saying, "We're so used to this that we're not even running away from the water cannons." And so that's positive in that the democratic spirit is still there. I just don't know exactly what happens with it next.
Yeah, it's really too bad. Ivanishvili does sound very much like a Putin mini-me, doesn't he? With
And a
his
Bond villain.
Yeah, yeah. The other hot burning issue that I wanted to talk to you about was, of course, Ukraine. And
Mhm.
there, the news, you talked about good news. Well, it appears that the Russian summer offensive has largely been stymied, does it not?
So I will say I just got back from Ukraine 3 days ago, 3.5 days ago. Time's a blur because it's a long trip. Um, so there's always a mix of news with Ukraine because there is still a full scale invasion. I was in Kiev and Lviv where there were major missile and drone attacks. And so that's awful and people suffer and die. But this narrative that sometimes comes out in the media that Russia's winning, that there's no way Ukraine can hold on. You just pointed to it exactly. They have not had a successful offensive. They have not gained much ground. There's been minor gains, but Ukraine and Russia both are doing major drone warfare. Ukraine to defend their people, Russia to attack kids sleeping in their beds in the front lines. Um, but unfortunately, last week the temperature started plummeting again in Ukraine as we get closer towards winter. I was there, it almost snowed, it was quite cold. And so that meant Russia saw the time to start attacking the energy infrastructure again. And they've hit Ukraine quite hard in that regard. Putin is a terrorist, so he hasn't gained much on the front lines on the battlefield. So he takes out electricity. He, I believe, took out the infrastructure that hurt the ability to get water in some areas, and hits hospitals, hits schools, hits kids, and hit a civilian train. So not much success on the battlefield, but it's easier to go after little kids.
What was your sense of morale since you just returned?
It was better when I was there last week than it was at the end of August. What I say is I'm mostly looking at morale in regard to US Ukraine relations because that's what I talk about a lot there. At the end of August, people were very worried after the Alaska summit. They felt, that Zelensky had had a good engagement in Washington after, but they were really nervous seeing what looked like Trump warming up on Putin. Now they feel better because Trump seems to be souring on Putin. He seems to genuinely be mad at him, to realize that Putin does not want peace, and simultaneously has warmed relations with Zelensky. So people are relieved there, but there's always a so what. It's nice to have better true social posts and better rhetoric, but where are the sanctions? Where's our ceasefire? Where are these tomahawks? But the thought is that it's going in the right direction. There's some other areas that look more promising, like potential movement on the Russian sovereign assets, but people are exhausted. And every year since the full-scale invasion, there's been worries that this winter will be the worst. And I just heard this winter might actually be the worst. And there's concern because the energy system's getting hit. And this year, there's not USAID to help. So the Europeans will need to step in there more. And people are exhausted and could be cold. And I don't think they're super hopeful that an end will come anytime immediately.
So, you're quite right to point to the Russian attacks on energy infrastructure in Ukraine by Russia. But it is also the case that the Ukrainians have been scoring some big hits inside Russia as well. The Security Service of Ukraine, according to Business Insider, says that almost 40% of the capacity of Russian refineries is already idle because of their long strike campaign. And President Zelensky himself says that the fuel shortage in Russia is already approaching 20%. This specifically concerns their gasoline, end quote. And Zelensky says they're tapping into diesel reserves. So Isn't it also the case that Ukraine is really inflicting serious damage on the Russian economy?
I'm very glad you mentioned that because that is an important aspect on every level, but it does tie to the morale too. I did hear a lot of pride from Ukrainians and look what we're doing, some jokes of like, we're helping, the world market, the world climate. Look at this. We've taken out the oil refineries and a lot of pleasure and jokes at the idea that Russians are maybe a bit irritated that they're waiting longer in their gas queue. Ukrainians have done amazing things with their drones, and they should be proud that they have hit Russia in this way. They're dealing it in a way that is focused on the oil. Russia hits a hospital, Ukraine hits an oil refinery. That's a big difference. And so I would expect more of this to come. And, I will say that they're very proud, and they should be, of all of the developments they've had on drones. I got to drive a, naval drone just in testing. I didn't blow anything up, but I got to do that on this recent trip, and, just to see the innovation and the space there, of people trying to help and to, move as quickly as possible with the technology. It's really amazing.
Well, Shelby, you may not have been a combatant on the battlefield, but you are a combatant in the intellectual and the political
Oh,
war on behalf of Ukraine. I'm grateful to you for sharing your insights.
thank you very much.
Thank you.